thought I'd make a quick instructional video on how to make the marble maze runners. I noticed that there's a few tutorials, but some of them can be hard to understand, so I thought I'd actually video the process of one I found and add in the little changes and things that I've made, and hopefully it'll make it a bit easier if anybody else wants to make one too. So all we need, and I'll show you that in a minute, is 4 bits of fabric, 3 pieces of flannelette and 1 piece of cotton. Just plain old quilting cotton, a marble, and then your sewing machine basically from there. So what you'll end up with is this when it's finished. So you've got a marble encased between layers of fabric, you've got the maze lines, and then the marble just runs its way through. So the top is a plain just quilting cotton. I've just used homespun to make it nice and easy to see, and then on the back is I've just used a pattern flannelette, and depending on the pattern you've got and the colour stitching you decide to have in your bobbin will determine how easy or hard it would be. So if you wanted to make it a bit more challenging, you could actually use a similar colour on the back. So I could have gone with a white or a green in my bobbin and then had the contrasting thread on top, and that just would have added an extra depth of challenge. So the line's easy to see on this side but could have been harder to see on the back, so that way you've got 2 kind of options that they can then flip between if they want to make it easier or harder. My machine doesn't like it when I have 2 different threads in the bobbin and to the top. It doesn't like it, so I haven't bothered with that. I'm just going to keep all of mine with the contrasting for both sides, but depending on what colour backing I end up using for each one will determine whether or not it's easy or hard to see. So for your supplies, you are going to need 8-inch squares. Now you could really use any kind of size you like, whether it's a square, whether it's a rectangle, it doesn't really matter. All that will change is the size of the maze that you end up with at the finish. You may end up with smaller or bigger, depending on the size that you go with, basically. So I've got a flannelette pattern for the back. I've got just a plain homespun for the top. And then for the middle layers, you actually want 2 pieces of flannelette. I'm just using plain. If you wanted to, you could skip the flannelette and interface it. I've found that this is just a lot easier. It makes it more secure. It's less likely for the marble to come through at some stage, and just gives a bit of extra strength and durability. It does not need to be anything flash. You could even cut up an old sheet if you had one. Just something that you can use in between the top and the bottom. You're not going to see this, so it honestly doesn't matter. I guess just be mindful, depending on what colour you're using for the top and the bottom, whether or not you're going to see it through. Other things you'll need is marbles. I just went to Kmart and picked up a bag of marbles. It cost me $2 for a pack of 20, and there was one ginormous ball that came in that, which you could use if you were doing it for a younger group. I just gave that to my boys to play with because they were bugging me for marbles. So I kept the little ones, and they got the big one to make it easier. And that's them in the background if you can hear it. Alright, the other things you'll need is a 1/4-inch foot if you've got one, or just a regular sewing foot, and an optional foot if you want to. If you've got it, it does make it a lot easier, is just an open-toed clear applique foot. It makes it a lot easier when you're doing the stitching on top to use this kind of foot rather than a 1/4-inch foot, and I'll show you when we get to that step. Oh, there's children in the background if you can hear them. Yay! Okay, so the next thing we've got here is my template for my stitching. I'll include a couple of templates that I've made up based on a finish size of 7.5 inches square. So that's what this one ended up being once I'd done all my initial stitching, was a 7.5 inch square. So I've done some patterns based on that, and I'll include them in a PDF file if anybody's interested in that, and I'll explain more about what these actually will mean when we get up to stitching. Other things you need is just a basic stuff: quilting ruler, rotary cutter to cut your fabrics initially, scissors to clip corners or to cut your fabric if you prefer, thread snippers, a pencil or something to mark your fabric with, and your choice of either wonder clips or pins, depending on your preference. You will need pins at one point, but to do the first initial bit. one clips work really well. Alright, so that's all of the supplies you need, and I will write all this down as well if you need it. Okay, so the next step will be starting to put it together. Alright, so to put this together, you start off with one of the pieces that you want to go into your lining. So I'm going to start off with a pink square. Then you want to get one of your backing and lay it print side up, and just get that as even as you kind of can. Then you want to lay down your cotton top. Now if you wanted to, you could use a print for the top, but just to make it easier to actually see, to make it kind of clear, I've just gone with plain, and then it doesn't matter what's right or wrong way up, as long as you've kind of got them, as long as the backing is facing up against the cotton, it doesn't really matter. Everything else, it doesn't really matter which way it kind of goes. And then last thing you want to do is then get your pink lining piece again and stick that on top. Now you can either use Wonder Clips and just pin around the edges, or you can use pins. So honestly, it doesn't really matter which. It all just depends on your preference. I haven't really bothered pinning this too much because it's not that big. It didn't really need it. I've just pinned the corners and then I've adjusted as I sewed. Do make sure though that you do keep a 2-inch gap to turn out with. I usually mark my gap with a red pin for the stop and a green pin for the start, so I kind of have an idea of where I'm going, but it's personal preference. So this is now ready to go over to the sewing machine. Okay, so I'm over at my sewing machine, and now you wanted to do this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm using my 1/4 inch foot. You want to make sure you back stitch for this, so go forward, back, and then go forward. And you want to sew the 1/4 inch the whole way around. To first corner, turn, pivot with the needle down. Realign if you need to. Make sure that you are catching all 4 layers within your seam. Again, readjust once you hit the next corner. Last turn. Right, when you get roughly 2 inches, just go back a few stitches and then go forwards. And then cut. Alright, so that, zoom out a bit, there we go. So I've now done the basic start. Now what you want to do is clip the corners without cutting into your seam and just take the tip off. just to round them out to make it a bit easier to push out. Later, being very careful not to cut your seams. If you need to, like I have, I've got a little bit that I didn't cut quite evenly. If you need to do a little bit of trimming so there's a little bit less bulk, go for it. Just don't cut near your stitching lines, basically. And then this is ready to go over to the ironing board and be turned out. Alright, so I'm over at my ironing board now. I've clipped all 4 corners and I've just cut off the threads that I had hanging. I'm just going to give this an initial press before I turn it out. So now I'm just going to reach on in, and when you go to turn it out, you want to turn it out so that these 2 bits are what you're actually pulling toward yourself. And you'll see the pink will disappear and all you'll get left with is the green. And there we go. Alright, so now you want to push out your corners and try and get them as nice and pointy as you can. I just use the tip of my scissors because I haven't got anything else but a chopstick or something similar. Apparently all works really well. I just use the tip of my scissors. So get in there, pop them out as best as you can. Taking care obviously not to put a hole in your stitches because I've done that before. Alright, so that then gives us our rough square. So now you want to give it a good press. So I just go around to each edge, making sure that the corners are all pointed out as much as I want them to be. I can't see the back. I prefer to have the green go over a little bit. That one I'm not quite happy with. There we go. And then I get to the top. The last bit I do is my top. The reason being I can push out any air to the top. Alright, so now you want to press this really well closed, making sure that you get a nice clean edge. So at this point you've got two options. You can either add in your marble and then go over and do your top stitching, or you can actually draw the lines on your fabric without the marble in, which makes it a bit easier to get your ruler around. I've done both methods and I found actually putting the marble in first was a lot easier because I knew exactly where my top stitching lines was going to be, because that's where I based my interior maze lines, was off where my top stitching around the edge was. So I'm going to add my marble into my bag at this point, and you want to keep it fairly centered in the middle of your piece. You don't want it anywhere near your sewing machine needle as you're sewing. So to hold it in place, just get yourself some pins and just use your pins to kind of make a little barricade around that marble so it can't go anywhere. Sorry, I realise you may not be able to see what I'm doing because I'm left-handed. There we go. So that marble is now not going to go anywhere. I'm happy with my edge being where it is. And then I just use some wonder clips, or you could use pins just to pin with this edge closed, and it's now ready to go to the sewing machine. Right, so I'm back over at the sewing machine, ready to sew. I'm doing a scant 1/4 inch seam, so you can see normally I'd have my fabric line up to this edge of the presser foot, but I'm actually doing it so that it's lining up to the inner edge instead, just to give a smaller seam and to give us more maze room. So if I zoom in a little bit, you'll be able to see what I mean. So I'm doing it to the inner edge rather than the outer edge of my 1/4 inch foot. And then you want to just go around. Now I'm actually going to go around twice when I do this, so I'll explain it when I get there. I'll probably speed this up a little bit so you don't have to watch me sewing around this, and I'll explain the next step when I get back to my starting point. Okay, so I'm just about back where I started. I've just got this last turn to go, and then I'll be back at my start point. Okay, so I've now reached my start point. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to sew back around on top of this stitching that I've already done, just to add a bit of extra strength and durability. The last thing we want is to have this marble come out from our stitching. So I'm doing everything that I do twice, basically. So I sew over it once, and then I sew over it again without taking my foot. Without taking the fabric out from underneath the press foot, without moving it, so that way I can have it exactly on what I've sewn. So I'm just going to go straight back around the edge, back to my start again, and then I'll be done. Alright, homeward stretch, and done. You do want to make sure that you've got a decent amount of bobbin for this, because we are stitching over everything twice. You want to make sure you've actually got quite a bit there, otherwise you could end up losing the bobbin roulette run, and nobody likes that. Alright, so zoom out a bit. Go. We've now completely sewn around, so this marble is now secure, so I can release it from its little hole. So it's now, it can kind of just free move within a little packet, but it's not going anywhere. So the next thing we want to do is fix up our threads. So don't snip these straight off once you've sewn. If you've got one of the machines that's not like mine and will actually has a thread cutter built in, then you won't have to do this step. But if you don't have a thread cutter built in like I do, this is something that I learned at a quilting class that I did many years ago. It was one of the best things I've ever learned. It's these little needles here. I don't know how well you can see it. Hang on, let me show you. There we go, focus. It's called a self-threading needle, so you can actually see just here on the tip, it's kind of got this little open bit that allows you just to literally click the thread through. This is gold. It saves you trying to thread things. It just clips in. So I do this to all my threads to bury them, just to give that extra bit of security. So right near my thread, I'll do this top one, I just put my needle in so it goes in between the two layers, and then I get my bit of thread, I wind it around the back, and I literally just click it through. So that's actually threaded right now. It's actually threaded, and then I pull it so it goes through the middle. And then I just repeat that again. Goes through, clip it, and in it goes. So much quicker, so much easier, a lot less hassle. And I use this for everything. Now when I need to bury a thread, it just makes it so much easier to do. So straight through, clip it, done. How easy was that? So now I'm good to snip my tails, which I'm going to then do. If you want to, you can give this another press just to make sure it's nice and flat. If you had any edges that you think curled up a little bit during the top stitching process. So I'm going to give this a quick press, I'm going to snip my threads, and then I'm going to show you how we put the lines on to do our maze. Okay, so for this next step, we're now going to make our maze. Okay, this is the part where we actually draw on the lines for our maze that we want to use. So I'm going to use the exact same pattern that I've done on this one. I've done up about 3 different designs. This one's probably the most complicated, I guess, both to stitch and to navigate your way through. So that's the one I'm going to show. The technique that I'm doing is the same for all of them, regardless of which pattern you pick. You can also make your own, so you're not limited to what I've done. I've just done these to get you started, because one of the things I found the hardest was not knowing what kind of pattern to do. So the biggest rule of thumb with this is, in order to fit your marble through, you want to have at least 1 1/4 inch gap between your lines. So if you've got a space like this here or here, where you want the marble to fit, it needs to be at least 1 1/4 inches to give the marble enough room to slip through. Okay, I've gone, some of these are a bit wider, some of them maybe are closer to 1 1/2, which is fine. Like I said, you can go big or small if you're thinking for like a 3 or 4 year old, which I have, and he's perfectly safe to use one of these. I do bigger, I have bigger gaps, maybe a 1 1/2 to 2 inch gap for him, because that's a bit easier for him to navigate through, whereas my 5 1/2 year old, this is a better pattern for him because it's a little bit more complicated and makes him think that little bit harder about where he needs to go. So that's your kind of your options. If you're wanting to make up your own, just print yourself up, use some grid paper, and just draw yourself a 7 1/2 inch square or whatever sized finished you're working with. So measure your finished piece and then work out your lines on that. So I've just made up a little diagram, which is this one here. You can see it, there we go, which I'll have, and on it there are a few different things. I'll include a key, but the basic thing is the green lines show the finished size, so that's your 7 1/2 inch square in this case. The black line is my top stitching line, which is a very scant 1/4 inch. I think mine's measuring at about 0.125, so a quarter of a quarter. The light blue lines are just my grid lines, just to give me an idea of where I'm measuring, and it just gave me some squares, rough squares to work with, and I've measured the distances down the side. And then the dark blue lines are what I'm actually going to trace to stitch. So I know roughly my first stitching line for the vertical column is at the 3 inch mark and goes down to the 1.5 inch mark on the horizontal. This is just a rough guide, I'm not following it perfectly. I made some adjustments on the last one I made as I did it, because I realised I wasn't going to quite have enough room as I thought, because my top stitching wasn't quite even. That's fine, it doesn't matter. If you're using like a pencil or a water soluble ink, if you make a mistake with your lines, it'll wash off if you're washing them. I've got a couple that I'll need to take out my stitching marks because I got them wrong. Alright, so then you get your ruler, so just your basic quilting ruler, and then I just measure out. So to start off with, I want to measure out my 1.5. So that's my rough 1.5 is about there. And I actually managed to get it just about smack on. That's alright. And then I'm measuring out to 3 because that's where this line is going to be from. And here we go. So I'm just going to start drawing on my pattern, basically. Alright, so I'm going to speed this video up for this step while I'm drawing all of these lines on, so you don't have to watch me do it, and then I'll take you over to the machine to sew. Alright, so I now have my lines all sewn, and I'm ready to take this over to the sewing machine. So what I'm going to do before I do that is just move my marble away. I'm going to start over here on the left hand side. So I'm just going to again pin my marble into this top corner just so he can't move and he's out of the way, and I'll move him around as I need to sew. Once you kind of get some of the maze in place, like once I've done this bit, when I go to do this side, I'll just put the marble into this corner. I won't need to worry about the pins, but the pins just make sure he doesn't interfere with my stitching. Alright, it's at this point that you actually want to change your foot if you're going to. So this is my clear applique foot that I'm going to use. It makes this so much easier compared to using my regular 1/4 inch foot. So I'm just going to take one off and put this one on. This is also a good point to check and make sure that you have enough bobbin thread, because again we're going to double stitch all of these. So to start with, I now have my lines all drawn on. What I tend to do to make this easier is I look for a starting point that's touching one of my outer edges. It's a lot easier to bury your threads from the outer edge than it is somewhere in the middle. So I find it's a lot easier to find somewhere to start from an edge, because you're going to work your way back to that point. So I get a rough line up to make sure I'm in place, and then I guide my needle in to make sure I'm actually lining it up exactly where I want it to start, and then I'm ready to sew. Alright, this you want to carefully follow your stitching lines. If you go off your stitching lines, it's not a big deal. Erase them later if you need to. Try and stitch them as close as you kind of can. And like we did with the edging, we're actually going to go back over it again, but I'll explain how I do that. Because you'll see here I've got this funny little intersection. Trying to get these bits in one go can be a bit confusing to understand. So let's start. If you need to as well, this is also a good point to actually decrease your stitching. So if you wanted to decrease your stitch length and make it a bit smaller so you can get around some of the tighter curves, that's a good point to do it too. But my regular stitch length is fine for this. Alright, here is where we pick a point, basically. So I've now got two ways I can go. Because I'm already started going down straight, I'm actually going to finish this line and go all the way down to the bottom, go across, and then go back again, up, across, and down. So I'm double stitching over each section once, and eventually I'll end up back at the top. So we go down, pivot, actually probably need to go down one more, no, yep. Follow the line and stop. Make sure your needle's down whenever you pivot and turn. At this point, again, you're going back over your lines as best as you can. And now, when I get to this point, rather than continuing to go back up to the top, this is where I turn and go down to this section. Watch out for your pins. And go back. Oops. If you do what I just did and went too far over, all I do, rather than trying to reverse and get it right, because even that can go wrong, I just flip it back around, put my needle up, needle down, and that gets me roughly back where I need it to be. I found that much easier than trying to rely on a reverse. Leave my tail out of the way. Alright, so at this point you want to finish where you started. I don't want to go over this gap. So if you're not quite confident, just use the needle. I have a needle up down button on my machine. And there we have it. I'm now back at the start and I've left my scissors at the iron. Just use these ones. Oops. They aren't quite sewing scissors, that's okay. Alright, so this is my first set of stitching is now done. And then at this point you can bury the threads here if you wanted to, and then you could basically go on and stitch the exact same way as I did with the other one. So starting at the edge and work your way around. So I'm going to speed up for the video for this bit. I'm going to finish sewing all of these and I'm going to bury my threads like I did before. And there we go. It is all done. One maze completely sewn. So the threads are snipped off. So now all you'll have to do is test it and see how your marble moves. Oop, that was a bit of a tight one. Done. Voila. I hope that makes it easier for you to understand.